Not the kind you notice right away, the kind that hides in the periphery, a flicker at the edge of your vision, gone when you turn your head. I caught it the first time at a neighborhood barbecue, 2 summers ago. My wife, Emily, was laughing at something someone had said, but her eyes weren't on me. They were locked, just for a beat too long, on a man I hadn't spoken to in years. A man who, once upon a time, had sat 2 rows behind me in high school chemistry, scribbling my test answers onto his own paper whenever the teacher turned away. His name was Daniel Mason. Daniel and I had history, not the friendly kind. In school, he was the sort who measured his worth by comparison, always trying to outdo, outshine, or outlast someone else. And for some reason, I was his benchmark. He didn't like it when I made varsity football. He didn't like it when I got the scholarship he wanted. He especially didn't like it when Emily, the girl he'd been circling for months, agreed to go to prom with me instead of him. That last one never healed. But life moved on. I went to college, graduated, built a career in architecture, married Emily, bought a house. Daniel, well, I stopped keeping track after high school. The only news I'd heard about him came from other people in passing. He's back in town. He's doing psychology now, runs a private practice, and once, he always said you had it easy. So when I saw him at that barbecue, beer in hand, wearing that same smug half-smile he'd worn at 17, my first instinct was to keep my distance. And I did. But I still noticed that flicker, that brief, wordless exchange between him and Emily. I told myself it was nothing. A courtesy glance. A polite smile. People reconnect at these things. I wasn't jealous by nature, and besides, Emily wasn't the kind of woman to. Well, back then, I still believed that. The weeks rolled on, and Daniel started showing up in conversation, not from me, but from her. I ran into Daniel at the coffee shop today, or Daniel said there's a new Italian place opening downtown. Each time, it was casual, natural, too natural, in hindsight. I didn't see the trap forming because there was no drama, no sudden changes. The danger of betrayal, I've learned, isn't in the explosion, it's in the slow drip. The steady erosion of something you thought was carved in stone. One rainy Thursday, Emily mentioned she was seeing a therapist. Stress from work, she said. She'd been short-tempered lately, snapping at things she normally wouldn't, and wanted to work through it. I thought it was a good idea. I even encouraged it. I didn't ask who the therapist was. Not then. It wasn't until months later, long after the first flicker, after the coffee shop mentions, after the easy assurances, that I learned the truth. And when I did, I realized Daniel Mason hadn't just been showing up in my wife's life by accident. He'd been planning this since high school. Emily's therapy appointments became part of the household rhythm, like grocery runs or laundry day. Every other Tuesday at 4, she'd leave the office early, come home just long enough to change into something comfortable but nice, and head back out. She always returned an hour later than her scheduled sessions, claiming traffic, a quick errand, or just needing some time to decompress. At first, I didn't think twice about it. If anything, I was relieved she was taking care of herself. My own work in architecture had its cycles of madness. Late nights at the drafting table, weekends lost to client meetings. If she found something that steadied her mood, who was I to question it? But small details began to collect in the corners of my mind. Like the perfume. Not hers. Emily's scent was something I'd known for years. Light, floral, a touch of vanilla. But twice, when she came home from those sessions, there was a different trace clinging to her clothes. A deeper, spicier cologne. Not overwhelming. Just enough to register before fading. Or the way her phone started living face down on the counter when it used to lie screen up. Notifications came less often, but when they did, she moved to another room before replying. I didn't leap to conclusions. Instead, I filed each moment away like an architect noting cracks in a foundation. Not an emergency yet, but worth watching. One evening, about 2 months into her therapy, I came home earlier than expected. Emily wasn't back yet, though her appointment should have ended an hour before. I was in the kitchen reheating leftovers when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I glanced out the window. Her car pulled in, but so did another. A black Audi. It stopped just long enough for me to see the driver. And there he was, leaning over the console to say something to her before she got out. Daniel Mason. I hadn't seen him since the barbecue, but his face was the same blend of confidence and calculation. He smiled at her, not the polite, neighborly kind, but the slow, measured one that meant more. Emily laughed at whatever he said, then shut the door and came inside. She froze when she saw me standing in the kitchen. "You're home early," she said, dropping her bag on the counter. "Yeah, wrapped up the Henderson project ahead of schedule." I gestured toward the driveway. "Was that Daniel?" Her answer came a fraction too quickly. "Oh yeah, his office is near mine. We just ran into each other after my session. He offered me a ride since it started raining." It wasn't raining. Not yet. The sky outside was cloudy, but dry. I didn't point that out. I just nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Because now I knew. Not what yet, but something. And I've learned the most dangerous thing you can give a man like me isn't anger. It's time. From that night on, I treated Emily's therapy sessions like a blueprint, measuring, marking, noting every line. If Daniel Mason had somehow worked his way into her orbit again, I wanted to know the how, the why, and, most of all, the when. But I wasn't about to confront her. Not yet. An accusation too early is like hammering nails before the frame is square. It warps the whole structure. Instead, I began mapping her schedule against my own. I arranged client meetings on her therapy days, using the excuse of flexible hours to slip out early. I drove unfamiliar streets, parked where I couldn't be seen, and waited. The first time I followed her, I kept it simple, just to confirm the location. She drove to a modest brick office on the east side of town. The sign out front read, Mason Counseling and Wellness. The confirmation was almost anticlimactic. So it was Daniel. I sat in my car, engine off, watching her disappear through the glass door. A few minutes later, the man himself walked past the window toward the lobby, same deliberate stride, same faint smirk. It was the first time I'd seen him in his professional habitat. Something about the way he leaned against the reception counter while speaking to her. It wasn't clinical. It wasn't detached. It was familiar. Too familiar. I stayed only long enough to see her emerge exactly 57 minutes later, her smile soft and unfocused, the kind people wear after being told exactly what they wanted to hear. The next few weeks, I kept my distance, but I began assembling a network of quiet informants without calling them that. An old college friend in IT helped me clone Emily's phone to a cloud account. My cousin, a private investigator, agreed to run discreet surveillance for a personal matter. Even the barista at Emily's favorite coffee shop became a source. People talk more than they realize when they think the other person isn't listening. The picture that emerged wasn't yet damning, but it was layered. Sessions that ran a little long. Texts from Daniel at odd hours, sometimes early morning, sometimes close to midnight. Mentions of coffee after work, or grabbing lunch near the park. No outright evidence of an affair, but every piece fit the same architectural principle. Form follows function. And the function here wasn't healing her mind. It was positioning himself in her life. The more I uncovered, the more I realized Daniel was playing a slow game. And if he was patient enough to lay this groundwork, then I would be patient enough to watch it grow. One evening, over dinner, Emily told me Daniel was considering hosting a wellness retreat for some of his clients. She spoke of it lightly, as if it were just another event in the community. But I noticed the way her eyes flickered, not unlike that first look at the barbecue. I smiled, took a sip of my wine, and asked all the right husbandly questions. How long would it be? Where? Who else might be going? She answered them all without hesitation. But I wasn't really listening to the answers. I was picturing the trap door I'd been building in my mind. And how, when the time came, she and Daniel would fall straight through it. It's funny how easily people tell you their plans when they believe you aren't a threat. Over the next 2 weeks, Emily grew more relaxed in her routines, as if the idea of hiding things had faded into background noise. She'd mentioned Daniel in passing, not realizing how each casual remark was another measurement in my blueprint. Daniel said I should try journaling before bed. Or, Daniel thinks my work stress might be affecting my sleep. Always Daniel thinks, or Daniel said, as if his words carried some quiet authority over her life. I made a choice then, not to challenge the name, not to so much as frown when she said it. Let her believe she had me in the comfortable, docile place where questions don't live. That's where people get sloppy. My cousin's surveillance turned up something I'd been expecting. The sessions sometimes stretched to nearly 2 hours. Twice, they didn't return to his office after leaving for coffee. Instead, they drove to a small boutique hotel near the lake. The first time, I thought perhaps he had another client there. The second time erased any doubt. But proof wasn't enough. Proof just ends things. I didn't want to end things. I wanted to design an ending. So, I began creating my foundation. Quietly shifting finances. A second bank account under a trust name. A private P.O. box. I revised my will, removed her from my insurance beneficiaries, and shifted property titles where I could without raising flags. Every move was a beam in the structure I was building, one that would stand when the rest of it came crashing down. At home, I played my part perfectly. I planned a weekend getaway for us, just 2 hours upstate. She looked surprised but pleased, the way you do when you think someone is still invested. I even made a point of suggesting she keep her next therapy appointment that Tuesday. We could leave after. She agreed without hesitation. I had other plans for that day. Through my cousin, I'd learned the boutique hotel didn't just have front desk records. They had security cameras, dated, grainy, but more than enough for what I needed. With a little quiet cooperation from a manager who didn't mind some cash in an envelope, I secured 3 weeks' worth of footage covering the exact window I'd been watching. When I slid the USB drive into my desk drawer that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt patient. The thing about Daniel Mason was that he'd spent most of his life trying to beat me. At football, at grades, at getting the girl. And he'd probably convinced himself he'd finally succeeded. But this time, he didn't know the game he was playing. Because I wasn't competing anymore. I was designing. And every design has a reveal. The Friday of our so-called getaway arrived with the kind of autumn weather travel magazines love to photograph. Crisp air, leaves burning gold and red, sunlight sharp but not harsh. Emily packed lightly, almost too lightly, for 2 nights away. Travel light, travel happy, she said with a smile as she zipped her bag. I smiled back. Makes sense. We set off in my truck, winding north on the Tulane road that cuts through the hills. She chatted easily, telling me about her week at work, a few offhand remarks about her next therapy appointment, even a story about a funny thing Daniel said. Each mention of his name was like hearing a faint creak in a beam I already knew was going to give way. It didn't rattle me. It reassured me. 2 hours later, we reached the inn. I'd chosen it carefully. Quiet, picturesque, full of little details that made couples feel like they were in a romance ad. The staff was discreet. I'd already arranged for a small anniversary welcome basket in the room, wine, chocolate, fresh fruit. I wanted her to see effort. I wanted her to believe in the effort. Because belief makes people careless. We spent the day walking the trails near the lake, taking in the turning leaves. I took photos of her when she wasn't looking, handed her my jacket when the wind turned cold. That night, we had dinner by the fireplace in the inn's dining room. She laughed a lot. She touched my arm when she spoke. Anyone looking from the outside would think we were exactly what we looked like. Married, comfortable, happy. That's the thing about facades. They're only as good as the scaffolding holding them up. And mine was almost ready to come down. On Saturday morning, while she was still asleep, I slipped downstairs to grab coffee. In reality, I stepped out to the payphone in the small post office across the street. My cousin had been waiting for my call. It's lined up, he said. Tuesday afternoon, right after her session. Good, I said. Make sure you get both angles. Both are covered, he assured me. When I returned to the room, Emily was sitting up in bed, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled. I was just texting Daniel about that book he recommended. He says it's a game changer. Sounds like it, I said, handing her the coffee. Her guard was completely down. She thought I was still the man I'd been for years, steady, predictable, safe. She thought the cracks she'd put in the walls between us would never spread. But on Tuesday, she'd see the foundation. And when she did, she'd realize it wasn't hers anymore. Tuesday arrived with the kind of clarity you can only get from a plan too well prepared to fail. I left the house early, telling Emily I had an on-site client meeting across town. She kissed me goodbye without hesitation. I noticed her perfume lingered in the air a little longer than usual, something floral layered over that faint spice I'd caught before. By mid-morning, I was parked 2 streets over from Mason Counseling and Wellness. My cousin was already in position, his camera case on the passenger seat, pretending to scroll through his phone like any commuter killing time. We'd worked out the signals. 1 text if they left separately, 2 if they left together, 3 if they made a detour. Emily's SUV rolled into the lot at 3:58 p.m. on the dot. Predictable as clockwork. Daniel's black Audi was already there. She walked in with the easy familiarity of someone arriving at a second home. I didn't move. I just watched the clock and listened to the hum of my own breathing. At 5:12, my phone buzzed, 3 short vibrations. My cousin's code for a detour. A minute later, I saw them emerge together. Daniel was holding the door for her, his hand just a little too close to her back, his smile too personal for professional courtesy. She laughed at something he said, tilting her head in that way she used to do with me when we were dating. They got into his car, and he pulled out of the lot, not toward the coffee shop, not toward the main road back into town. He took the lake route, the same one I knew by heart from the surveillance reports. I didn't follow directly. That would have been sloppy. Instead, I drove the long way around, arriving 15 minutes later at a turnout with a clear view of the boutique hotel's back entrance. My cousin was already parked on the opposite side, the telephoto lens resting against the window frame. I didn't need to see them go in together. I already knew they would. But watching the two of them disappear through those glass doors, wasn't pain anymore. It was confirmation. And confirmation is a kind of fuel. They stayed inside for exactly an hour and 32 minutes. Long enough that they couldn't call it coffee. Not long enough to pretend it was some extended therapy session. When they emerged, Emily's hair was pulled back differently, like she'd run her fingers through it. Daniel was saying something that made her laugh. Again that laugh, light and open, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. I didn't step out of the truck. I didn't yell. I didn't even take my own photos. That's what I had the footage for. Instead, I let them drive away. Emily back to me. Daniel to wherever he thought his victory lived. But the Real win was mine, because they had no idea that in 48 hours, I'd be in a conference room with my lawyer, a USB drive, and a plan that would make their little game look like the warm-up act. Wednesday was a day for smiling. Not the polite smile you wear in line at the grocery store, but the deliberate kind. The one you use when you're in control and the other person doesn't know it yet. Emily thought nothing of it. She kissed me goodbye in the morning, same as always. I watched her drive away, the taillights fading down the street, and then I got to work. The first call was to my lawyer, Mark. We'd been friends since my first year in architecture, the kind of man who could draft a divorce petition with one hand and get a property settlement with the other. I told him I'd be in tomorrow with documentation. He didn't ask for details. Mark knew me well enough to hear the weight in my voice. The second call was to my accountant. I wanted certain accounts liquidated into cashier's checks. Nothing illegal, just a strategic repositioning. He hesitated for maybe 3 seconds before agreeing to have them ready by Friday. Then I drafted emails to 2 clients who also happened to be well-connected socially. I wasn't explicit, not yet, but I hinted at significant changes in my personal life and my intention to remain fully focused on my work. These weren't just clients. They were people who loved to talk over wine and appetizers, and I knew the moment anything official happened, they'd carry the story far and wide. The version of the story I wanted told. At lunch, I drove to the print shop. In a plain manila envelope, I handed over still frames from the hotel security footage, Daniel and Emily, clear enough to be unmistakable. I had them printed in 2 sizes, standard photo and large format. Not for public use yet, but ready when needed. By mid-afternoon, I'd even looped in my cousin. Tomorrow's the day, I told him. You dropping it on her or both, he asked. Both, I said. No point in splitting the delivery. They can share the moment. That night at home, I kept everything perfectly normal. We made dinner together, pasta and salad, then watched a movie she'd been wanting to see. She leaned against me like nothing had changed. And in a way, nothing had for her. For me, though, the landscape had shifted completely. Every touch, every casual glance was a reminder that in less than 24 hours, she'd be looking at me through an entirely different lens. And Daniel Mason, man of confidence, collector of other people's victories, would find out that this time, the game had been designed by someone who knew how to build things that lasted, even if what I was building was meant to break them. Thursday morning felt like the first day of a long-awaited project. Every detail had been planned, every measurement taken twice. Now it was just a matter of assembly. I was at Mark's office by 9 a.m., USB drive in hand. He plugged it in, his expression flat at first, then tightening as the hotel footage began to play. Emily and Daniel stepping inside together. An hour and a half later, stepping out. That's all the court will need, he said finally. I'm not just aiming for court, I replied. Mark raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask. He'd known me too long to need the rest explained. We finalized the petition, adultery as the cause, division of assets locked in my favor, alimony off the table. Once the signatures were on paper, Mark made a call, his voice calm and deliberate. Serve them both this afternoon. At the same time. That phrase, at the same time, was the spine of my design. At noon, I drove to the Lakeside Conference Center. Daniel had rented one of its smaller banquet rooms for a professional development luncheon with a handful of other local counselors. My cousin had confirmed Emily would be there. Daniel had invited her to help with setup. That was the opening I needed. I walked in just as they were setting up the projector. Emily was arranging handouts at each seat. Daniel was fussing with the laptop, wearing that smug little half-smile he thought looked like confidence. He didn't notice me at first. She did. "Michael," she said, startled. "What are you?" I cut her off by stepping to the projector table and sliding my own USB into the port. The image on the screen flickered once, then sharpened into the still frame. Daniel and Emily, exiting the hotel. Clear faces. The date and time stamped in the corner. Gasps broke out among the few guests already seated. Daniel froze, his hands still hovering above the keyboard. Emily's mouth fell open, a flush rising to her cheeks. "This," I said, my voice calm and carrying, "is what your trusted counselor does with his married clients." Daniel recovered first, stepping toward me. "This is unprofessional and accurate," I finished for him. "Don't worry, everyone will have their own copy." I tapped the stack of envelopes I'd brought, each one containing the printed stills. "Consider it supplemental reading material." Emily took a step forward, her voice breaking. "Michael, please, not like this." I met her eyes. "Like exactly this. In public. With no way to twist it later." Mark's process server chose that exact moment to enter. "Daniel Mason?" he called. "Emily Mason?" Her maiden name hadn't been used in years, but the way he said it, firm, official, made it sound like the end of something. He handed each of them a manila envelope, then left without another word. Daniel tore his open, scanning the top page. His jaw tightened. Emily didn't even open hers. She just stood there, clutching it as if it were a live wire. I looked at the guests, most of whom were now staring at Daniel with a mix of disbelief and disgust. "Enjoy your lunch," I said, then turned and walked out. Outside, the autumn air felt cleaner somehow. Lighter. I didn't rush to the truck. I let the moment breathe. By the time I got in and started the engine, my phone was already buzzing. Texts, missed calls, voicemails. Emily's number. I let them all go unanswered. She'd have plenty of time to think about what to say. Daniel, too. Because this wasn't just about ending it. It was about ending it in such a way that every time they saw each other, every time they heard my name, they'd remember the exact moment the facade cracked in front of an audience. And know that I had designed it to be that way. By the time I woke up Friday morning, the aftershocks had already started. The public confrontation had been less than 24 hours ago, but its echo was everywhere. My phone was stacked with notifications, 47 unread texts, 23 missed calls, half a dozen voicemails. The names in the list were telling: old friends, clients, colleagues, neighbors. Some messages were direct and blunt. "Saw the photos. You okay?" Others were fishing expeditions disguised as sympathy. "If you need to talk." Then there were the vultures, people I barely knew suddenly acting like we'd been close for years, hoping I'd spill every detail over coffee. And then there was Emily. Her name was everywhere in the log. Dozens of calls, rapid-fire texts that went from pleading, "Please call me," to defensive, "It's not what you think," to outright angry, "You humiliated me." I didn't open any of them. The best way to win a war is to let your opponent swing at the air. But Daniel's fallout was much messier and much more public. My cousin had a few friends in the local mental health network, and by breakfast, I had screenshots from an online professional forum. The discussion thread was brutal. Some members tried to stay neutral. We should wait for the facts. But those voices were drowned out by the ones already dissecting the hotel footage. Words like boundary violation, ethical breach, and predatory conduct were being tossed around freely. A few posters claimed they'd suspected unprofessional closeness with clients before. Whether they meant Emily or someone else didn't matter. The suspicion alone would leave a mark. By mid-morning, Emily switched tactics. She tried calling my office line. My assistant buzzed me, sounding hesitant. "It's your wife," she said. "Not my wife," I corrected, my voice even. "And not my call." I could hear the pause in her breathing before she quietly said, "Understood," and disconnected. At noon, Mark called. Daniel's lawyer reached out. He said, the amusement in his voice barely contained. "They're asking if you'd consider a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a settlement. No details, just a number." I laughed outright. "Tell them the only number I care about is the case file number when the licensing board opens an investigation. And tell them I don't take bribes from the guilty." Emily's lawyer hadn't made a move yet, which told me she was still in shock, or scrambling to find counsel who'd be willing to take her case after the footage went public. Every day she delayed was another day my version of events became the official one in the court of public opinion. By late afternoon, I decided to accelerate the social side of the fallout. I went to the Lakeside Club, not my usual haunt, but one Daniel liked to visit to feel important. It was the kind of place where news wasn't just discussed, it was curated and delivered with a garnish. The reaction when I walked in told me everything I needed to know. Conversations dipped just enough for me to hear my own name, Daniel's, and Emily's in the same breath. One man clapped me on the shoulder with that look of "I heard, but I'll let you tell me." A woman at the bar asked softly, "Are you all right?" I gave them all the same calm, measured answer. She made her choice. I made mine. It's over. It's remarkable how far 6 words can travel when dropped in the right pond. By the time I left, I knew those exact words would be repeated a dozen times before the weekend was over. When I got home that night, there was an envelope jammed in the doorframe. Emily's handwriting on the front. I didn't even bother opening it. I walked it straight into my office, fed it into the shredder, and listened to the blades turn it into ribbons. If she had anything worth saying, she could say it under oath. Meanwhile, Daniel was facing 2 simultaneous battles, one with his licensing board, the other with the woman he'd thought was his prize. I knew Emily well enough to know she'd start pointing fingers soon, blaming him for ruining her life. And Daniel? He'd realized far too late that his high school grudge match had been over before it began. I didn't just beat them. I didn't even play their game. I designed the ending, and I'll let them live in it for the rest of their lives. The Monday after the confrontation felt strangely quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, more like the muffled silence you hear in a soundproof room, where the outside world is still moving but none of it can get in. It wasn't that the calls and messages had stopped. They hadn't. Emily's number still lit up my phone every few hours, alternating between calls and texts. The tone had shifted, though. The initial flurry of anger and accusation had drained out, replaced with something more desperate, almost transactional. "We need to talk. It's not too late to fix this. Please call me." I didn't respond. Not because I needed to punish her with silence, but because she had already said everything she needed to. Every time she walked into that office, every time she stayed at that hotel, every time she told me Daniel's name like it was supposed to mean something to me. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't reach out, but his presence was all over the news in his own professional circles. By midweek, my cousin sent me a copy of the formal notice from the state licensing board, preliminary inquiry into allegations of ethical misconduct. The language was sterile, but the weight of it was anything but. I knew enough about those processes to know that even if they didn't pull his license outright, the shadow would follow him for years. And I knew Daniel well enough to know he'd hate that more than losing any single case. Legally, the divorce process moved faster than most. Mark filed an expedited motion based on clear evidence of adultery. Between the footage, the witness statements, and the lack of any counter-narrative from Emily's side, the judge barely had to deliberate. My financial position came out untouched. The house, the accounts, the investments. Every piece I'd shifted before the reveal stayed exactly where I wanted it. Emily was granted nothing beyond the minimum legal settlement and no alimony. The moment the gavel came down, her last lifeline to my resources was severed. Socially, the story had already taken on a life of its own. The confrontation at the conference wasn't just gossip, it became the defining version of events. In small towns and tight networks, people remember the spectacle more than the details. And I had made sure the spectacle was unforgettable. A month later, I heard Emily had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Daniel wasn't living with her. Depending on who you asked, they were either taking a break or still seeing each other quietly. Either way, It didn't matter. Whatever they had wasn't a prize. It was two people clinging to each other because everyone else had backed away. I never confronted her again. There was nothing left to confront. I had the closure I needed the moment those still frames lit up the projector screen. Everything after that was just the echo. Sometimes, people ask me if I regret not trying to save the marriage. I give them the same answer every time. You don't rebuild a structure when the foundation is cracked beyond repair. You tear it down before it collapses on its own and takes you with it. The truth is, I don't think Emily ever understood that this wasn't about jealousy or vengeance. It wasn't even about Daniel. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, making sure that I wasn't just another man blindsided and broken, forced to pick up the pieces quietly while the people who shattered them walked away smiling. That's why I planned it the way I did. Why I waited. Why I let them believe they were in control right up until the moment they realized the floor beneath them had been cut away. And that's why I can walk through town now with my head high, without the weight of what-ifs or maybes. People still talk, of course. They always will. But the version of the story that stuck is the one I wanted. I didn't lose to Daniel Mason. I didn't lose to Emily. I built something stronger than either of them could ever take from me. A life they can't touch, a reputation they can't repair, and a memory they can't escape. Because every time they see each other, every time they remember that day, they'll know. I wasn't just the man they betrayed. I was the man who designed their ending. And I made it permanent.